of course, every series is different. You know, it's not set in stone how they're going to pan out, how that's all going to happen. But for you, when it's come to your series and the experience that you have with each of them, what are some key things that authors could keep in mind when planning a series with more than one book?
Um, I think you have to justify each book, because don't try and fit what could be one thick novel into three, because
Yeah.
nobody wants to wade through lots of padding just because you want to write a trilogy. So you have to have a story that can fill that, and a story that has can be written into satisfying episodes, because sort of the middle book of the trilogy can be a very frustrating experience for a lot of readers, because you sort of come in the middle of the story and then you go out with no resolution at the end. It can be, so you have to have like a minor story and a minor resolution at the end of the second book, just to give the reader the satisfaction and the reward for having slogged their way through it to get to the third one. And then the third one has to take all the plot from the first two and bring it all together, but also take the action up a level, and take the writing up a level, and the plot up a level, in order to justify being the third book. So yeah, it's a balancing act, definitely.
Yeah, for sure. And we'll get into the dreaded sophomore slump in a little bit. But Andrea, I'll toss the same question to you about some key things to keep in mind when planning a series, at least from your experience.
From my experience, it's definitely keeping in mind the arc of each book, and then the arc of the series as a whole. Because, yeah, if you're writing a trilogy, that second book is kind of the bridging book, but it still has to have that arc from the beginning to end where you feel like, well, some of the problems that we've started with in the beginning are resolved by the end.
Mm-hmm.
And my friends have shared this really neat little diagram that I found helpful for trilogies, where it's got like book 1, book 2, book 3, and then it's got like an arc for the whole trilogy, and then an arc for each book, and then an arc between book 1 and 2, and an arc between books 2 and 3. So,
I
mean,
think you shared it with me before last time we talked.
It's very simple.
It was like something like this, right?
Yeah, it's very... Yes, it's very simple, but it kind of gives you an idea like, hey, all these things have to be interconnected.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to keep in mind how one book is going to be flowing from one to the other, while each is also its own like contained story.
Yeah.
So it's a lot of pieces to juggle, I think, especially if you are writing with multiple POVs, because then you also have to take into account, well, what is the arc for this particular POV in this particular book?
Yeah.
So there's like the micro level and the macro level. And I think like when you are planning a series, you really have to take into account both of those.
Yeah, just this complicated web of arcs all intermingling. And
it is. It's a web.
It's a mess, man. And Dan, what about you from your experience? What are some key things that you've learned that you think are helpful to keep in mind when planning more than one book?
I really want to give readers more of the same, but something totally different with each book. So the reason that they love your first book, you want to make sure you give them that, whatever that is. But you can't just give them like more of the same and that's all you give them. You have to give a new experience. So like I guess I'm working on my third one now. I always try to keep the same sort of core sort of story type in a way, and some of the same characters, but try something different narratively or structurally that keeps it really fresh, so that each book sort of really stands on its own. So that's my big takeaway. I loved what was said before as well.
Nice. And E.G., what about you? If you have any key things.
Yeah, so I think for me, one of the biggest things to address was, given how much time, it's about 7 years between books, how the characters individually would change between each installation. And I think, I've seen times when people try to address this, and when there's a time jump, the traits of the characters become almost caricaturized later because they can't seem to get a grip on who their character is and how they would develop. So, have you guys seen Stranger Things?
Yeah.
The cute little kid with no teeth, Dustin, how in the first season, he swears every now and then and it's cute and funny. And then in the second season, when he's a little older, he swears all the time because the writers were like,
that's his thing.
The audience likes that,
Yeah.
That's his thing, right? I wanted to kind of avoid that because you don't want to just pick one trait that defines your character as they move through the series. You really have to keep a hold of who they are and how they would rationally develop over time. That goes for in-book too, of course, but just for me personally, since it was a between books time jump, that was something I had to be very aware of.
Yeah, and then to use that 7-year time gap as like an experiment in how would they reasonably evolve as a person during that period of time. Not like, oh, they're going to be exactly the same as 7 years ago, and they're going to be exactly the same as the 7 years before that. It's like you've put this time constraint, like in the context of the world, that forces you to give your characters the time to evolve. And I think even if you have a more condensed time period, Andrea, in your series, for example, where the characters need to have reasonable leaps in terms of their progression, whether that's a big leap or it's a little leap, it has to be justified within the context of what you established that character as, but what you've also promised in terms of the potentialities of what they could become. Because otherwise the reader's just going to be like, I don't fucking believe that. That's just ridiculous. Like this doesn't fit that character. And that's something that can break you out of a series. We've brought up characters a little bit here and then, but I'm really glad that you did, EG, because characters are sort of like, as Gareth mentioned this, and Dan, I think you mentioned this too, is like sequels give you the opportunity to flesh out characters in a more satisfying way, to give them more depth and to give them development progression. But you really have to be conscious of how you handle that. And Andrea, I'll toss it back to you, what you think about characters specifically in the context of series and how you approach the arcs and development of characters within that framework.
And yeah, that's funny because I had posed that question to some people as well about writing series. Like, do you feel like the characters have to have an arc for each book in your series? And I think the consensus was not necessarily.
It's contextual.
I mean, for mine, I feel like I knew where they were starting out and I knew where they were going to end up by the end of the series as far as their characters went. So I think some of it is, the beginning book, they definitely go through a character change in that first book. And then in the second book, some of that is kind of going more into depth into that character change and like what kind of, are they now like questioning some of the things that they didn't before because of that? And then, the third book is kind of like bringing that all home and like how does that fundamentally change them as a person? But there's always like setbacks too. I feel like, yeah, you can have your character undergo a pretty vast change from the beginning of one book to the end. But they're always going to be, changing some, like who you are as a person is a pretty profound thing. And I do feel like, when I'm writing fantasy, I'm like, well, that is kind of like a fantasy, is that this person is like fundamentally changing, right?
Yeah.
because it's like, we see so often that people don't necessarily change that much, or if they do, that they're constantly backsliding. So I think like when you have a series, you can kind of like address that a little bit more. Like, are they backsliding at all? And how permanent is this character change? And if it is permanent, like what new questions does that lead them to? So yeah, for mine, I did try to plan out like an arc for each of the POV characters as far as like, well, this is what they're going through in book one, and this is how their viewpoint changes, and then these are the setbacks that they have as a result of this change of viewpoint and this character change, and then this is how they finally get to the end of book three, which is like where they kind of have to really confront what that means to them, and how much they have to sacrifice really to be that person that they think that they are. It's like it's really just to me about like pushing the characters as much as possible.
Yeah, and I guess it all depends. Like if it's a character driven story, that's kind of like fundamental to the being of that series. And Gareth, you brought up earlier with Ack-Ack Macaque how books 2 and 3 gave you the opportunity to, send him into the depths of his soul and kind of twist everything on his head. But then book 3 is bringing things back to at least something a little bit more stable. So, for you with the Ack-Ack Macaque series or anything else that you've written in terms of series, how do you approach that idea of like characters and giving them the time to expand and flesh out?
Well, I tend to my writing has to be very character driven anyway, so I will only have a vague idea of what's going to happen, and I let the characters and their decisions kind of guide me a lot of the way, and oft times that takes me off piste when it comes to outlining. So for me, very much the choices that the characters make in the early books lead through to what happens in the later books, and it's the sorry, there's a cat attacking me. The consequences of their actions and their choices are what ultimately shape the finale. So.
Mm-hmm. Well, and Dan, what about you? What's your take on approaching characters from the perspective of a series or sequels?
I have two things I want to talk about here. One is this. There seems to be this almost religious doctrinal idea that a character arc, a character has to be fundamentally changed from the beginning of the book to the end of the book. And while oftentimes that works and that could be a great character arc, there's something, I don't know if the word is a flat arc, where a character goes through all of these experiences and ends up the same place that they started. Maybe they have become, more secure in who they are. But I feel like the character doesn't have to fundamentally change. So, and one of the things I like about a multi-POV story is you can have some characters who undergo radical change, some characters you might kill off, other characters might end up in the same place they started, but they now know, like, this is who I was supposed to be. So that's one character thought. Another thought, that one thing I love about writing series is you can take a minor character from one book, make them a main POV character from another book. And in so doing, you see them in a different way. And also the way they see the main characters from the first book can give you a different perspective. So it allows you to see characters from the inside and from the outside in very different ways. And it's very satisfying to do that.
Yeah, I like that. And I like the idea that you consciously challenge what, obviously there's a rough status quo in terms of characters, especially now that we're in a time where a lot more books are more character driven, and I think it is good to challenge that a little bit. But like you said, Dan, it's perfect when you have multiple POVs that give you the opportunity to present different sorts of arcs, whether it's something that's flat or a little bit more drastic, what have you. And that also gives a lot more roundness to the story as a whole, because like Andrea said, people a lot of the time just don't change, or they change a little bit at a time and then they regress, and they, don't necessarily make big moves all at once to say like, I'm going to change in this way and I'm going to do it, and tomorrow that's how it is. It's an incremental thing, and all of us do everything incrementally, and sometimes it's like 2 steps forward, 15 steps back, however it is. It's not so set in stone, it's not so easy. And EG, I'm going to toss it back to you. Do you want to get in on the character discussion a little bit more?
Yeah, sure. I think that Dan's on something interesting about the characters, don't necessarily have to fundamentally change as people. I'm a big believer in the fact that people can change, but it takes, obviously concerted effort and probably some contextual change of their lives around them. But you don't have to do that, with your characters. And I think something really interesting is to explore how different sides of characters show up in different situations. So if your character ends up in a fundamentally different situation at the end of the book than they were at the beginning, they might still be very much the same character, but they also might behave drastically differently. And so I think that's kind of an interesting thing to explore, because, you don't have to entirely alter who they are as a person.
Mm-hmm.
To see some cool dynamism.